Does anyone else feel like it's a weird coincidence that the DNA in the Idaho 4 case was found on the accessory to a weapon? Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk a little bit about the knife sheath, the key piece of evidence against Bryan Kohberger in the Idaho 4 case. It's been widely reported that this is the piece of evidence that law enforcement used to arrest Bryan Kohberger. Now, it wasn't included in the PCA, and we'll talk about the reasons for that here in just a minute. But doesn't that seem odd that investigators wouldn't include their main piece of information in the probable cause affidavit? You know, the official document that allows law enforcement to just come and destroy your life as you know it. First, let's talk about what type of sheath that this was. It clearly belonged to a K-bar knife. Now, the K-bar is a capable blade, but is it really capable enough to commit these types of crimes? I've talked about this utility knife before in previous videos. Now, because this sheath is so specific to this particular type of knife, then it would only make sense that this was the weapon used to commit the Idaho 4 crimes, right? Let's talk about where this knife sheath was conveniently located. It was found on Maddie's bed, right next to two of the victims on the upper level. So, if law enforcement found this knife sheath partially under one of the victims, then that would mean that this was likely the weapon that was used to commit these crimes. Now, we don't know where this sheath came from. It's very possible that this knife sheath could have belonged to someone who lived in this house. It's possible that this knife belonged to one of the victims because we have no idea where this sheath came from. It's a movable object and can be moved around rather easily. This was not a piece of evidence that was anchored to the crime scene, which means that this sheath could have already been inside the house, or it could have been brought inside the house from outside. It really could have come from anywhere. So we know that investigators found a very small amount of touch DNA on the button snap when they processed this knife sheath. So this is touch DNA. Now, if this was a drop of Bryan Kohberger's blood, we'd be having a whole different conversation. But this was touch DNA. There's a lot of debate among people in the justice system about whether touch DNA should even be allowed and admissible in court at this point, because it's really not definitive. So it can be transferred from a third party, which means that if you shake someone's hand and then they turn around and open a door, it's very possible that they could transfer your DNA onto that doorknob without you ever touching that door. So that's kind of scary to think about, that you could shake someone's hand and then they could be carrying around your DNA with the ability to transfer it somewhere else. It's kind of weird to think about that your DNA could be walking around on somebody else's hand and you not even be there. Now, I'm not saying that someone did put Bryan Kohberger's DNA on this piece of evidence. I'm just saying that it is possible. It is possible that someone could have transferred Bryan Kohberger's DNA onto this button snap, left the sheath at the crime scene, and created this scenario that we're now seeing in the Idaho 4 case. I'm also not saying that law enforcement planted this knife sheath on Maddie's bed. This knife sheath could have been put on Maddie's bed by anybody. There's also the possibility that it was in the house the entire time. This K-bar could have easily belonged to Kaylee or Maddie. Maybe they kept it under their bed for protection. Investigators would not be able to determine where this knife sheath came from. It could have already been inside the house, or someone could have brought it in the morning of the crimes. This K-bar could very well have belonged to any one of these victims, and maybe it was taken from them and used to commit these crimes. That would make more sense, because why would the assailant really be walking around this house with the knife still in the sheath? That just wouldn't make sense. Now, it is very possible that this sheath was pulled from the belt of the attacker. That's possible. But then that leads us to another question, and that is, was this attacker wearing coveralls or not? I mean, do you see any belt loops on these coveralls? You don't wear a belt when you're wearing coveralls. Law enforcement claims that they found a receipt for Dickey's coveralls in Bryan Kohberger's belongings. Now, they made it a point to put that out there, that they found this receipt for these Dickey's coveralls. But if Bryan Kohberger was wearing Dickey's coveralls, then in my opinion, he would not have been wearing a belt. Let's say that he was wearing a belt, and that one of these victims was pulling on the knife sheath that was attached to this belt that the assailant was wearing. I'm very familiar with the K-bar. I own a K-bar, and I use it when I'm out camping. It's a great utility knife. But I can tell you that the loop on the K-bar sheath is very sturdy, and I don't believe that it would break if it was being pulled on. In my opinion, the attacker's belt would break before the sheath. So it would make more sense that this K-bar, along with the sheath, was already inside the house and possibly belonged to one of these roommates. We know that these University of Idaho students like their knives and they like wearing masks. We've seen that in photos and social media posts. Now, what about the animal mutilations? You know, the media kind of grazed over the dog and the coyotes, and that's not really normal. You know, they kind of just talked about it like it was nothing. But it is not common to find mutilated animals, you know, around your neighborhood. And we know that there were reports of this in the direct area of the King Roadhouse. Okay, let's get back to the knife sheath that was found at the crime scene. Now, this DNA would be a lot more solid if it was found on an immovable object inside the King Roadhouse. Something that was a fixture of the crime scene. Because the knife sheath could easily have been brought from anywhere. It could have already been inside the house. It could have been brought from outside of the house. This sheath could have been easily moved. So when DNA is found on a permanent fixture inside of this crime scene, then you know that whoever's DNA that it is was inside that house. But since it was found on a movable object, investigators cannot determine that whoever's DNA, in this case, Bryan Kohberger, was inside this house because this knife sheath could have come from anywhere. Now, the reason that the prosecution did not include the DNA collected from the button snap of the sheath in the PCA was because they knew that it would not stand up in court if it was even allowed to be introduced as evidence. So law enforcement didn't feel as though the touch DNA was solid enough to present in court, but they did believe that it was solid enough for them to arrest Bryan Kohberger. Make that make sense. So now the prosecution cannot even show how they used the DNA to zero in and arrest this suspect. If this DNA wasn't solid enough to even bring to court, how did they get an arrest warrant to arrest Bryan Kohberger using this DNA? It's good enough to take Bryan Kohberger's freedom away, but it's not good enough to present in court. Now, Ann Taylor knows this. Ann Taylor continues to ask the prosecution to show their work as to how they zeroed in on her client with this DNA evidence. Now, she knows now that the prosecution does not possess this evidence. And that's going to be a problem because Ann Taylor wants to know how they were able to secure this arrest warrant. So how does the prosecution use the IgG information and the touch DNA in order to take Bryan Kohberger's freedom? And then once he's in custody, they try to sweep it all under the rug like it never happened. You know, it's almost like they just plucked Bryan Kohberger right out of the population. So they used this touch DNA from the knife sheath to arrest Bryan Kohberger. But now they can't show the process of how they determined that this was Bryan Kohberger's DNA. So now they're just trying to forget it all. You know, they're trying to pull the old switcheroo. Now they want to use the DNA that they collected directly from Bryan Kohberger when they arrested him, rather than the DNA that they actually say that they used from the knife sheath. The way in which investigators processed this touch DNA that was found on this knife sheath is questionable, in my opinion. If you can't go to court and explain the process of how you narrowed down this touch DNA to Bryan Kohberger, then that's a problem. You need to be able to show your work. You can't just say, well, you're going to have to trust us on this one. You're in court now, and now you need to be able to prove your allegations. You need to be able to show your work and how you came to Bryan Kohberger. Right now, the prosecution can't do that. That's odd because they've already arrested Bryan Kohberger. He's already been sitting in jail for 1.5 years. And Bill Thompson still can't show how they zeroed in on Bryan Kohberger. That's not transparency. That's not justice. It kind of makes me think that maybe Bill Thompson is holding out for some type of plea deal and hoping that Bryan Kohberger will plea out of this. But that's not going to happen. So somehow this prosecution is going to have to show their work. And Ann Taylor is staying right on top of this, because every time that she asks Bill Thompson for this information and he continues to say that the prosecution doesn't have it, it just continues to look worse and worse for this prosecution. Now, thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you like my video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. We'll see you next time.